Hello, everyone, and welcome to our talk, Life Hacking Cloud Architectures. We don't want to bother you with a lot of who we are, just a few words about ourselves. Thorsten and I are consultants at Novatech Consulting Company, and what we mainly do lies around cloud architectures. So that's why we are, of course, very interested in securing those architectures. Our employer, Novatech, is a consulting company mainly based in Germany with more than 400 employees. We have several branches in Germany and one branch in Spain. And what we mainly do is modern software development, agile methodology consulting, technical enablement, and much more. Well, we all know that everything that, or almost everything in our daily life today is connected to the internet somehow. A lot of critical systems, infrastructure, smart devices, almost everything that we say or do is connected to the internet. And at the same time, the attacks and threats are evolving very fast. And if we do not protect our systems and data against that, a lot of bad scenarios can happen. And mentioning that, let's have a look on some examples of things that you would not like to hear or read about your employers one day. So let's start with what happened in EasyJet around 5 years ago, when a data breach caused exposing the credit card information of more than 2,000 customers. That made them not compliant with the GDPR, and you can imagine how bad that could be. So they could have paid a huge fine of almost 4% of their annual turnover. It can go even worse with what happened with LinkedIn 4 years ago. And the funny fact here is that when we design our APIs, usually, we care about details like how to name them. Do I use customer or customers? Which method do I use? Is it both or both? And we forget to secure those APIs. And exploiting the LinkedIn APIs, the data of almost all the LinkedIn users has been exposed and sold out on the dark web. Another example is what happened in GitHub 3 years ago when a malware has been integrated into a dependency which is used in very well-known projects like Kubernetes, Docker, Python, and so on. And what it did is that it allowed sending the whole environmental variables to the attacker's machine. And last but not least, what happened very recently, around 2 weeks ago in the Volkswagen Group, when they discovered that there is a huge data breach exposing the data of almost 800,000 electrical cars. Those data included the location and the contact details of the owners, for example. And the reports talked about using the Amazon cloud storage and a misconfiguration there, which was managed by the software subsidiary Carriot that may have caused that. It was discovered, by the way, by the European Hacker Association Chaos Computer Club. They reported that to them. So, in order not to fall into such traps, it's better to be prepared. It's better to do threat modeling, penetration testing, bring your application architecture security into the scene. And we prepared something for you today. And it's important to mention that it's not totally made up. So it's based on real-world examples that we see and face in our daily job. Maybe the company itself is fictional, however, the story behind it is not. So we have a consulting company in the financial sector. It's called Never Victim Consult, and they claim to protect you against cryptocurrency heists. They did a great step. They moved to cloud. They were, of course, proud of that, and they talked about it, which is also very good. However, that's how they caught our attention. We read their blog posts, we had a look on some technologies they used, and even better, we got the chance to know their DevOps team who's responsible for that. And with that information, let's meet them and play a little bit with their cloud architecture. So I will hand over to our attacker, Thorsten.
That's why I'm coming onto the stage. So we want to know more about this company because we assume there are some interesting information there, like customer data or more private things. So how to start? What do we already know about this company? We know the domain, right? So there's not much more. We know at least the domain of the blog post. So we could do starting collecting information by having a look on the domain. So we could do a DNS enumeration. DNS enum for never victim consult. And by doing so, we see or can recognize they are using Google Cloud, right? Google Cloud for DNS as a managed service. That's nice to know. That also that comes for our knowledge, but it also comes with a downside for us from a attacking perspective because Cloud DNS prevents its user before the zone transfer attack. So that's a problem. By having a zone transfer attack, I would get all the subdomains and the IP addresses, which is nice to know for me, but unfortunately I can't do that. So I need to find another strategy. So I'm going to do a brute force attack, right? So now I'm scanning this particular domain with the top 5,000 from the 1 million mostly used subdomain names, and I will see if there's a hit. So I can recognize there's an auto-discover subdomain, or at least a CNAME entry. So probably they're using Office 365. They have a mail server on a test stage, and test is always something that catches my attention, right? So I want to dive a bit deeper. So I'm going to do the same attack on the test subdomain, right? So maybe that's where their software development team lives, in the test domain. That happens quite often. And we got more results here. We can see still some Office 365, the mail server, and there's a Git. There is something called social, Nexus, which is a artifact storage, typically in the Java world. There's a dev machine, and there's Jenkins. So please raise your hand if you ever used or know what Jenkins is. That's good, right? So you understand if I'm saying, well, Jenkins is quite interesting for me, because Jenkins maybe builds software and maybe deploys software. So it has access to something which is interesting for me. So I would like to have access to that Jenkins. The only thing I know here is its subdomain. So I am going to scan that Jenkins. Did you ever heard of Metasploit? Raise your hand, please. That's a bit. So Metasploit is a collection of tools for penetration testing. So there's much inside, and I could use Metasploit once it's started, now it's starting, to scan that domain and particular software. So there it is. So I'm going to use an auxiliary scanner for HTTP-based applications, because Jenkins communicates HTTP-based. And I just want to know a bit more on this Jenkins. So I'm going to set the remote host to Jenkins test. And now I'm going to find out that it's quite modern version. That's again a downside for me, because there's no easy peasy way to get access here. The most interesting endpoints, I'm not authorized to use them, so I need to invest a bit more here. So, how would you gain access to the Jenkins? Any idea here? well, yeah, you expect from me to life hack, so maybe I can get some assistance of you here. The configuration? Authentication token, that would be awesome if I could authenticate me against Jenkins. So let's try to do this. So I'm going to use a auxiliary scanner for HTTP-based Jenkins login, setting the remote host. Well, I just typed that. And now I'm going to set the remote port to 80 because that particular plugin expects 8080. And I'm setting something different because I'm used to Jenkins, so I'm well, give me a second here. Login URL. So I'm setting the login URL to JSpring security check because that's the default configuration. If you get a Jenkins by default, it's configured with the Spring security check. And this one I will tell you in a bit about that. So I'm setting stubborn success. I just want to have one working access. And maybe I did not forget anything here. Let's see. So I prepared a username list because I already know some people who are working at Never Victim Consult. I read their blog post. So I used a username list generator to generate usernames in typical patterns. And you can see one name is Jeffrey van der Linden, and I generated different variations of that particular name. And I used a password list. To be honest, here in this talk, I'm using a subset of a password list. So typically, did you ever heard of the Rocky list? Raise your hand if you'd ever heard of that. Some of you. That's a list, I think it's about 37 million leaked passwords, public available on GitHub, right? And there's a good chance that this works, right? And I do have a working password here. And this is not a 123 password. Of course, the Rocky list also includes admin or 1234, but this one, that's not, well, let's call it sophisticated one. Well, so now I do have access probably. So give me a second. I'm going to a private window and try to access. That's the Jenkins, right? So now the real hack will happen. How do I get from this console to my VNC here? Well, that's a life lesson for you here. Right, so I will paste that here, and now I need to get the password. So that I never managed to invest time to do this in a more efficient way, but well. That's not what you see in movies, that's true. Right, okay, so bear with me, and this seems to be working, right? So now I do have access to a Jenkins instance, just by having a bit of luck. I scanned the domain, I guessed the password, so there are more sophisticated attacks on the password, but trust me, this works quite often. So what I can recognize here is that you remember the social DNS entry? They're doing something with social, obviously. There's a deploy job, an infrastructure, a stress test job, a CI build job. So, well, that's interesting. And by seeing infrastructure or deploy, I recognize, well, they use cloud DNS from Google. Probably where do they deploy this? Maybe on Google Cloud as well. And somehow, if they deploy that, they need to authenticate and authorize on their cloud provider. And what you can also recognize here, that maintaining Jenkins plugins is not only a hard job to do for you, they have the same problem. There's a credentials plugin, and obviously they're using it, right? And there are some credentials around here, the Kubernetes config, so they use Kubernetes. And that's the most interesting, right? A service account. But unfortunately, I can't read that here, right? So that's my goal, to get this one, right? And I will show you a little trick how to get this one. That's something, right? There is a value behind this. And that's not a joke. This is an encrypted string. It's encrypted by a key which is managed by Jenkins. Typically, it's generated while Jenkins has been installed. So I don't have this key, but what I can do is I'm asking Jenkins for decrypting this one for me. Well, let's do if I remember that. Well, that's promising, right? So what's that? Any ideas? Say loud out here. It's probably a certificate, probably a JSON Web Token, but, well, we can't read it, right? So what we need to do is to use the tooling that, well, DevOps admins also are using. It's base64 encoded. That's what you can see here. And it's encoded, not decrypted anymore, so I could decode it, right? That's quite easy, right? So I could go to, I could do the encoded. Well, that's the encoded one. I copied there, and now I could decode it. And you could do that with. Well, so I used base64 decode and put it into GCP as a JSON because I'm expected it to be something in JSON because I know there's a good chance for Google Cloud and they call it service account that's going to be authenticated in JSON. So let's read it. There it is, right? So I just stole that. What can I do with that one? I could use it to authenticate with Google Cloud, with the G-Cloud tooling. And then I could initialize that. Well, I want to re-initialize because I don't want to catch any attention here. I'm using that service account with, well, whatever the project's name is. Don't want to update anything, and it seems like if I do have access, right? So I could browse a bit around. For example, I could use clusters lists. So now I'm asking G-Cloud to list all the Kubernetes cluster where I do have access to. And obviously there are 2 of them, right? I could also do, well, remember that. I could check to which storages I do have access. And I obviously do have access to database backup. So I could copy that. That would be easy. What I'm really interested in is to have access to that Kubernetes cluster because they are building and deploying a software, obviously, what we recognize on Jenkins. So I would like to have access to that place where the application lives. So getting the credentials works like this in G-Cloud, right? So let's try that. And now I do have a working Kubernetes config. I don't know how many permissions or roles I do have there, but I at least have a running kubeconfig. So I need something to browse around there. So I'm going to use an outdated tool here. I'm using Octant because I still like that one. It is, for me, a fast way to browse around. Did you ever use Octant or know that? Nope. So now you know what's discontinued. And, well, I can see namespaces here. There are some. There is, well, the Kubernetes default ones. There's toolchain. Well, I already know parts of the toolchain, so I'm not interested in that one anymore. But there's something I don't know. Why that's something called app. And there are workloads in here. There are pods. There's a running pod. It has database information here. And I even can use the terminal. So, well, now I'm in the container itself. I could browse around and could replace that application jar, which is obviously running, with something that suits me a bit more. Well, can I do that? Since I'm root, I could do that. And that's default, right? But I do have another idea. And since I'm taking more time than typically for this talk, I'm speeding up a bit. I could provide a sidecar container. Raise your hand if you know what a sidecar container is. Well, that's quite good. So it's a container who is able to catch all the TCP and UDP traffic, because it's on a shared network in a pod, and send it to a machine which is on my administration, and then I can take some time and go through the traffic that I just captured and find out what is this application. Is there something in for me? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to place that one here. We prepared a sidecar container for this purpose. And maybe I did no mistake here. That worked. And now, if nobody has a look on the test environment of a team which just made it to the cloud, which is highly probable, they don't recognize this, I now got a restart on that pod and all the containers inside it. And well, there's now one more container running in it, and that's my sidecar. And my sidecar is capturing the traffic, right? So now I'm going to take some time, maybe a nap, and find out what are they doing here. In the meantime, Mirna will continue this talk, and I'm preparing something for you while Mirna is talking.
Well, what did we see till now? We saw a red team trying to attack the cloud architecture of Never Victim Consult. Maybe the attacker was lucky here to be able to brute force Jenkins and get the credentials to log in. However, there are different ways, maybe other sophisticated ways, just as example, the Groovy script console, the Metasploit, Metabrita session, and others. And to wrap it up, the attacker started with a reconnaissance phase. He discovered the domains of Never Victim Consult. He found out they have stages. They are using Jenkins. He brute forced Jenkins, got access into Jenkins. Then there he could steal the service account key. With that key, he got access to their Google Cloud. And there he had a look around. He could, for example, download the database backup, making use of their data. There might be something interesting in there. And he discovered they have a Kubernetes cluster, and they have a backend application. And he tried to inject that sidecar container, which silently listens to all the TCP traffic on the bot's primary network interface to send it to his machine and make use of it later on. And he succeeded in doing that. And now, let's assume that I'm the head of security at Never Victim Consult, and I noticed some strange behaviors on the test environment. So there were some increased egress costs of the traffic leaving the cluster. There were some downtimes running updated Kubernetes deployments. So I was pretty sure there's something going on the test environment. And I assumed that the attacker will come back and try some stuff or similar things on the prod environment. And that's why I took some actions. As usual, I started asking all the employees to change their passwords. I deployed Ingress in order to log the traffic in front of all the internet-facing applications. And I made use of some security and observability tools. And mentioning that, I made use of Tetragon. Any of you heard of Tetragon before or used it? No one. Okay, interesting. Tetragon is a security observability and runtime enforcement tool developed by the company Isovalent as an extension of their project Cillium. It's eBPF based and it's Kubernetes aware, so it understands all the Kubernetes objects and identities. And what it actually does is that it enables you to define and apply policies on the operating system kernel level at runtime. By default, it captures all the process execution and termination events. However, you can extend that using the so-called tracing policies. You can define those tracing policies as custom resource definitions in Kubernetes, and with that, you can hook into any kernel function or system call to trace arbitrary events and optionally do some actions when there is a match. So, for example, in our case, we worked on the kernel function level, and we said whenever the process TCP dump tries to call that kernel function fd install, which is called whenever a file descriptor is installed in the process file descriptor table, so whenever the process tries to do any I/O operation with a file, I want Tetragon to kill the process and send a sick kill, prevent it from continuing. We could do that in many different ways. We could, for example, say whenever this process tries to execute, kill it directly before it even tries to call any other kernel functions. And now let's see that in action. So we assume that our attacker will come back and try the same things on the prod environment. And as we said, this time when the attacker brute forces Jenkins, we should see some logs using the Ingress deployed in front of Jenkins in this case.
And you can see, I'm trying to do the brute force again, right?
So let's see which bots do we have.
Well, because I can't log in anymore. Somebody changed his password, so I need to find a new password, right? So I'm now taking time to do brute force again. Hopefully nobody catches that.
So let's have a look on the logs of that Ingress bot here and see what we get. Well, now we are getting all the login attempts with, since we have something to log the traffic. And in real-world scenarios, this should be connected to a CM system, security information and event management system that gathers the events and information from different resources and notifies us whenever something happens. So here we could react directly in real world. We could, for example, send the attacker to a honeypot to gain some time, to analyze some stuff. We could block their IP address. However, for the purpose of this talk, let's continue. And now, the attacker will come back again and try to do the same thing with the Kubernetes cluster on the broad environment. So he will try to inject that sidecar container to send or forward the TCP traffic. And let's see what happens now when we watch the bots of that backend application. So on one side, we will watch the bots of the backend application to see what happens. And on the other side, we will gather the logs from all the Tetragon agents on all the Kubernetes worker nodes in a compacted way. It also supports other outputs like JSON, for example. However, it's easier for us to see list details in this talk. And let's see what happens when the attacker
Well, there's again my
injects.
edit mode of the Kubernetes manifest. I prepared it, and I'm now executing that. Did no typo again, and will recognize it won't work.
So here we go. We are getting errors. Bots are crashing, and we've just seen a kill sent by Tetragon here. So the process was prevented from continuing. He could not inject that sidecar container. This was just an example of how things could be done. You can do a lot of more sophisticated things using Tetragon and, of course, other tools. However, we wanted just to show an example here using Tetragon. And to summarize it up, as we said, the attacker came up, tried to do the same stuff on the broad environment. However, this time we had something to log the traffic in front of Jenkins, and we could be notified that there is something going on, and we could react directly. This time we continued for the purpose of this talk, and the attacker did the same, got access to their Google Cloud, and discovered they are also using a Kubernetes cluster on their broad environment. He wanted to do the same, injecting that sidecar container to send all the TCP traffic. However, this time Tetragon reacted directly, killing that process. And with that being said, we can say that observability is not a silver bullet, however, it's a paramount. And with that, we can say thank you so much for your listening, and I think we have 10 minutes time for any questions. Yes, please.
You're asking if it could make a difference and a significant. Well, it depends on your private network. Do you mean a virtual private network on a cloud provider?
No, because the general push is you don't make those public endpoints public endpoints, right?
Yeah.
So if that's the case,
If that's the case, and if it's the case that your private network is well secured, then yes. But there are many entry points into private networks, right? So one would be the notebook that I just got on the LHC tour yesterday, which was public available, right? So you just need an entry point to a private network. And if that's not the case, and well, we do have customers where this is clearly a very good barrier, very good control, well, then it's more secure. But this does not prevent you from an inside job. Well, there's the malicious insider is always a important threat. But you're definitely, if there are many ifs in this area, but if the network is secure, which is one of the fallacies, the network is available and secure, then that would be a tough one. Yeah. Thanks. Further questions? Yes, sir. No question. You. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, to detect, yes, that there is a process, TCP dump executed.
Root access on the node. Do you want to answer?
I don't know if I got your question correctly. Can you repeat it? If you have root access on the node to do what? Sorry?
that is something I would call a more sophisticated attack, right? So if I would do a better sidecar, what I would recognize I don't have access, or if I would do a better capturing attack, which is just one of many, many available attacks, I could flush that if I have access to. But if you're, for example, using the AKS, the Azure Kubernetes service, you don't have root access to the worker nodes operating system. Not sure if that's still the case on Google Cloud, but remember that, well, sometimes you recognize that root access is an issue if you want to install Tetragon, which is sometimes harder on other cloud providers. Well, Google Cloud provides this out of the box with a special image. But you're right, and your question goes to how sophisticated is the attack vector, and we do sometimes have audience who definitely, well, I think that's an outstanding question, flushing the dump, right? So I would not know how to do that. You also know, but it's a good idea.
Yeah. Theoretically, yes. So there should be other ways to restrict that, yeah.
More questions? Yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah. Goes into the same direction. If I do have access to the Kubernetes API, and it's not a well-maintained Kubernetes service, pushing images to the local registry is something that's possible. So you could also refer to the image hash, and the issue is pushing the image to the node or to the cluster, and then you could use the image hash and it's still available. So getting the image into the cluster is not the hardest thing if you have access to the API itself. But, well, that would have been another way. In this case, I would create an image repository inside Google Cloud, because I'm obviously having access to the Google Cloud, and that's by default available from the Google Kubernetes service, which is something you need to know. You need to disable that. It's enabled by default. Yeah. Thanks. More questions? Yes.
One more question to this attack vector. So obviously there was probably quite many of the over top 10 Kubernetes points, like privileges, right? We were running too much privileges on a Jenkins server, where we probably could have a lot of less privileges in the first place.
Yeah. So that's why we choose Jenkins for this demo, and why we choose to let it in the default configuration, because that's what we see, and most of our customers who just did a migration job. So if you would have proper role-based access control, that would not work here. So except I am using a Jenkins exploit. I did not show this today, but if you search on Metasploit or on an exploit database for Jenkins exploits, you will find many results. That's something that I will not manage to do in 10 minutes. But Jenkins is a highly used software, and as a result out of that, you have many exploits available. Some easy to use, some not so easy to use.
But in this case we focus on Jenkins, but if we prevent it on the Kubernetes side, okay, do whatever you want with Jenkins, you can maybe only have limited use cases. Then
Yeah.
with Jenkins, then okay, you can toy around, restart the deployments. Maybe you would have a lot of more restrictions. Right? So.
Same response on that. It's always, well, at least having Jenkins, the only way to deploy on a Kubernetes cluster is not basic anymore, right? It's like, that's a good setup, not using personal deployment keys, right? So the next thing that the Kubernetes owner needs to do is securing the service accounts. And that's something we do not see often, that service accounts on a Kubernetes cluster are secured or with proper RBAC in place. So you do have write permissions on your namespace. And by having write permissions, you can edit a deployment, and then you go into this attack vector again. So you're right, with proper ABAC, that would be better. But this one it has ABAC enabled. But the default and the more advanced one still allows this attack vector to succeed, because we're using the service account, which is the default way you do that today.
Maybe one more follow-up
Yeah.
question. Once you have access to the pod, so GCP probably already set up a lot of defaults, so you cannot home yourself. We didn't try to break out of the container
Yeah.
inside, so probably this is already prevented, right? So we didn't try this out in the first place.
Well, there's nothing prevented because I spawned a root shell. So I showed who am I? I'm root. So
Yeah, but within the pod, right? Not
within the pod. So I could also put a capture traffic inside this pod, because I could do a SCP from a trusted host into the pod, and I do not need the sidecar. It's just easy to show, and it's a good idea to do this with a sidecar. But if I'm not in a private network and I have a trusted source where I could use my capture tool and SCP it into it, I would have the same result. Yes.
Maybe more advice. If I'm an enterprise, when do I actually call for such work like security testing? Because we're not competent to go through all of this
Yeah.
blue, green, and penetration testing.
Yeah.
What would typically be driving you to fund this penetration testing to let's say, to my cluster or to my
So you're asking for an advice?
yeah more
Yeah.
how do
Use open source tooling.
how do evaluate that?
There is so much tooling available. Like let's start with Snyk or the so secure parts. So there's so much open source available. With default checks, is your cluster at least a bit secure? So of course I could advertise our consulting services here, which I'm not going to do, but I did it. Yeah. Right. Well, there's much tooling out there. And by installing, for example, Tetragon, you always get a check inside with that. Well, we could use Snyk here. What's the other one we advertise here?
Dexys, and this is called Dexys. They're the other company.
Yeah.
And
Well.
I understand there
Yeah.
there are many ship left tools.
Yeah. At least checking it generates you. There's a weak point. You should focus on that. That's something you should definitely use, and that comes for free within. You get results within an hour, and that's fine. Yeah. Well, but if you use something like Jenkins, there's nothing that can prevent you here except you put work into it. So Jenkins is fine to use if you, well, it comes as a software that you need to manage, but you must manage it. Don't use their user database. Don't use default configurations. And I guess there are many default configurations out there. So that's okay. Well, thank you so much for being here.